Welcome to the Provoke Media Podcast. I'm Megan Keogan, host of today's episode and head of content partnerships here at Provoke. It's not an easy time to be in the C-suite following 2.5 years of chaos. A new era of the working world is quite literally at our doorsteps. This begs the question of how can anyone possibly prep themselves, let alone leadership teams, for the new uncharted days ahead. This monumental shift not only means that leaders must communicate differently, but it also means that those who advise them must reevaluate their own approaches. In today's episode, we'll dig into findings from Padilla's extensive report on this very topic after surveying and interviewing more than 100 C-suite leaders. With me today are Matt Kucharski, president of Padilla, and Sam Sventek, VP of Communications at 3M. Sam, Matt, thank you both so much for being here today.
You bet, Megan. Good to see you. Hey, Sam.
Likewise.
Good to see you.
Hey, Matt. Thanks, Megan.
Yes, Matt, can you give us a little background on the report that Padilla has produced, and even a bit about how you and Sam have come to know each other through this particular space?
Sure. Well, let's start with the first one, or the last one first. Sam and I have had a relationship for several years. We've done some work for 3M, but also just a professional colleague kind of relationship. And Sam had called and said he was getting his group together for their first retreat, an in-person retreat in a long time, and asked if I might provide some perspective on what we're seeing and hearing out there. And we collaborated a little bit. And one of the things that we have been observing over the past 2.5 years is leaders showing up differently, and that impacting how they're communicating differently. And of course, that has implications for us as the communicators who advise them. So we talked about that as a topic, and Sam thought it would be good, particularly because his team is focused heavily on internal and exec comms. And we said, let's go one further. Let's just not make this about our observations. Let's actually go and get some data to back it up. And so we surveyed, we did a survey of 100 C-suite leaders and company owners, 1,000 employed adults to get the employee perspective. And then I did 25 in-depth interviews with C-suite leaders as well to get a little bit behind the curtain a bit and get some verbatims. And that was the foundation for the report that we put out. We first shared it with Sam's team at his retreat, and then since then have been sharing it with anybody who's been interested in it.
Fascinating. That is a massive time commitment. How long did the overall start to publishing process take?
It took a couple months to gather the research and about 30 seconds to put together the presentation the night before Sam's meeting. No, it actually came together very nicely because we did have the ideas and the observations ahead of time. So the research was really used to essentially validate our hypotheses about what we're seeing out there and answer a few more of the why questions. So it was over the course of a couple months this summer, spring and summer.
Yeah. Thank you. So interesting. And we're going to unpack a lot more about that particular report as we delve in today. Sam, really great to have you with us and excited to hear kind of the receiving end of the benefits of this report and how it's worked for you. But tell us a little bit about your role at 3M and we'll kick it off to how we've worked together. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Matt. I lead employee and executive comms for 3M, and going through the last couple of years, right, with the pandemic, a lot of things had changed, right? A lot of things had changed geopolitically, not only just the pandemic with COVID, the economy had shifted, the importance of social justice communication, and I think getting my team together in person for the first time, sort of after everyone had been, working remotely. We always love to have benchmarking and external perspective, right? That can help guide us and help us do our jobs better. And so, I thought of Matt right away and how his team could help provide that perspective. They work with a lot of different clients, obviously. And some of the learnings in the report are really interesting and things that we've taken into our communication strategy and reflected on and made adjustments and shifts as a result of it. So it'll be fun and interesting, I think, to get into it here today. So thanks.
Absolutely. Your first in-person retreat, the size of your leadership team, how many folks were you working with or do you work with?
Yeah, so my team, so we had about 40 people. We did have some people remote as well, right? We have people internationally that are part of the team as well, but sort of our St. Paul based team was in person for the first time.
And then when you do those large retreats or those in-person things, are you also working with the entirety of the like local regional staff, or is it really, was that a retreat very specific to the leadership?
No, I mean, this was my whole team, my broader team. So this included everyone that does communications at 3M, focused on employee and executive comms. And we, the external perspective from Matt, we do a strategy workshop. We also do some team building exercises as part of that. So it was a full day for us to kind of reconnect and get energized about the year ahead.
Nice. Okay, so let's dig in, Matt. We have this large report. You kind of gave us the background of how it came together. But as you have been unrolling it and introducing it to folks, what is sort of the top line summary of findings and what people need to know about it, just sort of as our baseline here going in today?
Yeah, Megan, I guess if I were to summarize it in one word, it would be conflicted. Leaders today are conflicted on a whole variety of fronts. They're conflicted in that there are a whole series of events that are happening, external events that are happening that they're needing to respond to that they don't have a lot of control over. Certainly COVID being one of them, but polarized politics, unsettled employees, supply chain shortages, war in Ukraine, that's creating some conflict. More external stimuli than there have been in most times in their career. Second area of conflict is they've got multiple generations in the workforce who have different expectations of leadership. And there's one great quote in there about, when I tell a boomer that I don't have things figured out yet, they are wondering why I'm even talking to them. But I have to tell the Gen X or the Gen Zer, because if I don't tell them, they think I'm not working on it. So how do you have communication that lands with these different groups? Third is really an issue of a very conflicted economic environment right now. Costs going up, needing employees wanting more flexibility, needing more to pay more attention to the benefits side of things. And with those costs going up, at the same time, we all know that there's trouble on the horizon, and they're forecasting, a softness. So they're having to spend more money and put more investment into these things and drive their costs up when they know down the road that's going to catch up with them. And then the last area of conflict, which to me was one of the most telling, was the very skill sets that they're needing to display right now are in direct conflict with the skill sets that they were brought up with. They're having to learn new tools that are not the tools that help them get to where they are today. So all of those are rolled up into that whole word conflict.
It's a lot. It's a lot to unpack, and it's a lot to even putting it in perspective for any of us who have weathered the storm, and it's a lot. It's just a lot to wrap our heads around that is what the last 2 years have captured. And
yeah, and if you internalize it and think about what we've all dealt with on a personal level, and then you lead 1,000, 5,000, 50,000 person organization, you still have those feelings yourself. You're human, right? But you're also thinking about the impact on all those other people. So that's creating a big challenge, but it also creates opportunity for us as advisors to put things in perspective.
Stepping away or like looking at from the outside perspective in, when we are, to your point about like we've all experienced it, developing this system or process for how to train leaders who are living in it in real time seems like a big task, or there isn't like a precedent as to how it was done before. And I think that's what's really interesting kind of about your report, and how you and Sam have worked together is figuring out how does that go into practice, and what does that look like when there isn't something to look back on like, well, this was how we did it 10 years ago, or this is how we did it the first time around.
Well, a lot of it was in the past with executive communications was, how do I deliver the message? And what message do I deliver? But now there has to be a certain level of teaching relatability. and teaching humanism and recognizing that that authenticity word is thrown around so much, but the messenger and how the messenger comes off is almost as important as the message. And that's creating a whole different approach to communications, approach to training the leaders as communicators, whether they're spokespeople or whether just communicating at a town hall meeting. It's a different set of skills.
Absolutely. Sam, this would be, I guess, a really great time to ask you how, as you've been implementing this, how has it shifted how you train your leaders, or how is the conversation and the really expectation of how they communicate with their teams and their staff changed in the last couple of years?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Megan. We used to, I think historically, we'd always done media training with executives, right? We want them to be prepared if they get questions from the media. I think now it's a lot more broad than that. It's how do you, we have to spend a lot more time, I think, thinking about how we teach people to communicate better to their employees, right? I think the world, and Matt describes it a little bit in terms of a lot of the changes over the last couple of years, but the amount of change and how rapid it is really has grown significantly, right? And so I think in the old days, right, a quarterly town hall meeting from an executive, now it's like, from quarter to quarter, things are changing week to week, right? And so I think we've really increased the number of touch points that our leaders have, varied our channels, right? There's a lot, we need to take a multi-channel approach. We need to have a lot more listening sessions from our leaders. We need to, Matt mentioned relatability. I think getting, thinking and speaking on your feet, skills like that are really important, and recovering the company strategy and direction multiple times. So it is really a shift in terms of how we're doing it now, right? Compared to how we were doing it, I think 2.5 years ago, pre-pandemic.
Yeah. When you are, and I guess this is really, I'll ask both of you this question, but as we think about the shift in the communication style, before even getting to that question is more like, what are the driving reasons? So is it to avoid quiet quitting? Is it to work on employee retention and engagement? Is it to stay committed to the greater purpose of an organization? What are some of the factors that go into deciding kind of the equation or the recipe that fits each organization in their trainings?
That's a great question, because there are those obvious ones: quiet quitting, the retention, help with purpose. I actually think one that's probably the most strategically valuable to the C-suite leader who needs to communicate more effectively is getting stakeholders to buy into change, because the business models have fundamentally changed as a result of what we're seeing, whether it's COVID, whether it's the murder of George Floyd, whether it's changes to climate, and those changes are happening on a micro basis all the time, and getting employees, and particularly employees, but also customers, also partners, comfortable with change and acting in a way that helps facilitate that change. That, to me, is the most strategically valuable reason for adjusting communication style.
Yeah, and getting employees want to understand why and everything, and how this connects to that. And so I think as everything's changing, you have to continually make those connections between things, back to the company strategy, back to the purpose of the company, with a focus on driving performance, right? And so you have to keep making those connections as you move ahead. That's really important for employees to understand.
And I know, Sam, you had the opportunity to review these findings and kind of glean from them, being one of the first folks to sort of see the overall report. Were there any standout things that maybe were highlighted that you hadn't been able to put your finger on before, that you were seeing or experiencing yourself at 3M?
I think just the level of, we identified, we do a lot of measuring of communications at 3M, and we've really ramped that up over the last several years. And I think, we've talked a lot about, I think measuring communications is a challenge that a lot of communications team have. Like, how do we make sure what we're doing is effective? We had landed on the KPIs for my team were about understanding, accessibility, and transparency. And I think what the findings that Matt and his team worked on really confirmed that those were the right KPIs for us. And transparency is a key one in there. And that maybe wouldn't have been there a couple of years ago. And you really have to think through now, the risks of not being transparent. I think we always get worried about sharing too much information. Okay, this could show up somewhere externally, or, we don't want to share that because we're not quite ready. I think there's a risk in not sharing that information too. And sometimes it may be good not to share it, but I think thinking through the pros and cons and the risks with that is important. And I think, it's just one of many things that I think my team gleaned from this study.
Sam's team does a really nice job of applying what are oftentimes contemporary marketing techniques to the internal environment, measurement tools, multi-channel communications, content strategy, and it's just really impressive. And so his team is really well equipped to take advantage of that. The transparency one is interesting because, speaking of conflicted, there's a recognition of needing to be more transparent, but also there's a frustration with that transparency that leaders are feeling. And in the report, we use the analogy of it's a little bit like being preparing meals at the chef's table, where you've got all your customers all around you as you and your team are making the meal. And if you drop a piece of chicken on the floor, everybody's going to see it. And if you've got an argument with, the person sauteing the vegetables, that argument is happening out in public and you're being judged. And so that transparency can be frustrating at times. And what some leaders have done is they've said, look, we need to be more transparent, but 100% transparency is just impractical. We're going to go for translucent. We're going to share what we're doing, but we're not going to share every last little gritty detail because we don't want to freak people out.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting conflict.
Is there a greater focus, or should there be a greater focus on having the conversation or how to handle the conversation when that chicken has dropped on the floor versus being comfortable being transparent in the first place? So like the proactive versus reactive conversation skill set.
So to beat this analogy to death, the problem is having the conversation about the chicken dropping on the floor means we're not talking about the great meal we're preparing anymore. So being overly transparent creates the potential that you get off track and you lose perspective on what we're really trying to accomplish. And that's one of the big dangers is we don't want to talk about the chicken dropping on the floor. What we want to talk about is the great chicken meal that we're preparing here. And yeah, maybe we have some errors along the way, but we don't want that to be the focus. I don't know what you think, Sam.
Yeah, and the transparency could be explaining, hey, listen, hey, that dropped, and here's how that fits in anything, and hey, but bringing them back to the focus of and the priorities, right, of the company and what you're trying to drive. And so I think you can do both. Megan, I think it is training leaders to be good. Again, I said thinking and speaking on your feet earlier, and I think that's a big part of it, right, is being reactive, being able to handle things in the moment, being okay saying, I don't know, but I'll find that information out later and I'll get back to you, those types of things. I think sometimes leaders feel like they have to have all the answers before they go into a session. And now what we're seeing is, going into listening sessions, you don't have to have all the answers. Employees just want to be, employees as a stakeholder, they just want to be acknowledged. They want to be heard. They want to have the discussion. And it doesn't always mean you have to have, exactly the answer they're looking for. You get a lot of credit for just being able to have the discussion.
We're using employees a lot as an example here, Megan, but
yeah,
this applies to a lot of stakeholder groups. Customers are dealing with change, supply chain partners dealing with change, investors, community members. So even though it's just naturally, it's easy to go to employees, and we should. The kind of findings in the report and the things we all learn definitely apply to interaction and building relationships with other stakeholder groups.
One of the trends that I'm hearing, or kind of red threads through all of this, is being a part of the discussion and being a part of the conversation, where for a long time, I think many of us were more accustomed to C-suite sort of being in this glass box or separate from where the work gets done, and more of a role where they are presented to with updates, or they're given the updates and they're briefed on things. But perhaps, is it fair to say that throughout the pandemic, whether it's been like because we've seen each other in each other's living rooms over Zoom, and we've had this new sense of familiarity, more of a team player role or a contributor, like maybe some of that hierarchy, the gap is closed a little, and that's a new role, but also requires new communication. Is that a piece of the puzzle, or is that fair to say?
Yeah, Megan, maybe a quick example. I'll let Matt go too. I mean, one of the things we did during the pandemic and after is really leverage Yammer as a collaboration platform and encourage our leaders to get in there and post and engage with employees. And I think at first, that's new ground, right? Because typically from leaders, as you said, it was more of a one-way, I think, in terms of electronic communication. And so, but it's really opened up a lot of dialogue between leaders, and again, using employees as the example here, but using that platform to help do that is really, we've seen a lot of benefit there, right? And that's helped, I think, with some of the transparency.
What's funny about it, and somewhat ironic, is tools like Yammer and Teams channels and that kind of thing, they have been used to create more collaboration, more accessibility. They also create rumor mills. They create the environment for people to whisper, right? So being okay with the fact that you're creating these new channels for communications is something that leaders have had to get used to. You talked about something really important, Megan, which is that helping, getting out of the glass tower, the glass bubble, and getting more involved. I see two fundamental reasons why that has to happen. One, we already talked about, which is relatability, right? Hard to be relatable when you have to go through 6 layers to actually, provide an update.
Yeah.
But the second goes back to our discussion of change. You think about it, change that happens to someone is stressful. Change where someone is involved in the change can be energizing. So what I think really good leaders are doing is recognizing, hey, if I'm going to implement the kind of changes I want to make, I need to involve people in driving that change so they feel like they're part of it, they get energized by it, versus feeling like they're a victim of whatever decisions have been made on their behalf.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good strategy for and a compelling reason why you got to get out of the bubble.
Yeah. In that transition where maybe leaders have sort of shifted their daily presence or their involvement in, say, Teams or Yammer or things like that. In the report finding or in your research, did you find that anybody sensed creating that trust initially was kind of a challenge? Because I can imagine if one day my CEO is sitting next to me and is, chatting to me, and I'm like, why are they talking to me? Why, was there ever kind of a conversation, or did that just happen naturally through the pandemic that trust was already a little bit easier?
I'd be interested in what Sam's perspective is on this, but what I did see when I talked to some of those leaders was a recognition that they needed to maybe not necessarily actively engage in the conversations that were taking place, but they needed to actually listen to the conversations and be present and show that they cared. We have something at Padilla called Way to Go Wednesday. That's just this running stream of, kudos to everybody, just shout outs to people. And it's if I go in there and do a bunch of shout outs, I kind of suck the air out of the room. But if I go in and show that I'm actually paying attention and like ones that I see, it lets the kind of environment happen. I learn a lot, for one thing. And then also they know that I'm present.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that we saw during the pandemic, and of course we all on my team working from home, leaders working from home, I think there was, it got so busy, right? And leaders were kind of running parallel path with you, trying to figure it out. And so I think you did lose a little bit of that formality, right? I think it was a little bit less like, hey, I got to spend this much time to get the slides to look exactly like this. And it was a little bit more like, okay, we're going to bring in a draft and we're going to work on it together. We did that with our leaders. And so I think that has carried us through, right? Where now you've got a little bit more of that closer connection between leaders and employees. Of course, they're just a green light or red light away on Teams from you can ping them, which of course you couldn't do. But I do think some of the formality, shifted a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, Matt, I hope this doesn't, I know that the report was very focused on C-suite, but I'm in this conversation, I have developed a question, which is, how has this affected middle managers, where the managing up and the conversation up has always sort of been a piece of the puzzle for a middle manager, but also communicating on the daily basis to a team. So being that middle voice has always notoriously been kind of a challenging role in a company. And I'm wondering, has any of the kind of takeaways or lessons that you've learned from this report, does any of that apply also to like middle management?
Yeah, I think it does, Megan, because one of the things that that we point out in the report is, and you can see in some of the verbatims from leaders, is they articulate what kind of people they want at the table with them. People who can operate in the gray, people who can, do what Sam talked about, can kind of like collaborate along the way, who maybe set hierarchy aside in order to get the job done, who can communicate with some level of empathy, who can show some flexibility. Those are attributes that they're looking for from their communicators, but their attributes are looking for anybody they want at that table. So to the extent that those attributes are valuable to leaders, they're good signals for mid-level managers to understand that the skill sets that maybe historically were used to get ahead and to advance maybe aren't the ones that are the best now. And I think that bodes well actually for more empathetic leaders. And I think it bodes well actually for women in leadership as well, because many of the traits that are being brought forth, not to overgeneralize, but many of the traits that are not needed are traits that are inherently feminine traits. Whether they're expressed by a male or female, they're feminine traits, and that's a good thing.
I think one other point I'd make, just to add on, I think, it's important for middle managers to have middle managers that really understand the complexities of what's going on. We talked about earlier a lot of the change that's happening, right? And how the company strategy is shifting, whether it's supply chain issues, the economy's changing, there's a lot of things happening. And so middle managers really have a tough job, right? Because they're getting direction from above. They're having to keep their teams informed at a pace that is like it, really like it hasn't been before, right? At that rapid pace. And so I think people that can understand the complexities, what's going on in the world, what's going on in the company, they're super in touch with different stakeholders. They're doing benchmarking. They're talking to people like Matt that can give them perspective. They'll be most successful, because I think those leaders in the middle are key as part of the change management approach and what's happening in companies today. I mean, they're really critical. And so having a strong team there and an informed team that can navigate all these changes is really important.
Really good point.
Absolutely. I know we had touched on it just a little bit ago, Sam, but the ways that 3M is measuring the success of this program and this approach. Matt had mentioned that historically you've always been an organization that relied a lot on metrics and measurement. And wondering if you're willing to share a little bit about how you've been kind of benchmarking the success of this new teaching. Yeah, thanks,
Megan. I mean, we run communications just like we would run, a different business or a different function, right? And data, insights, metrics, intelligence are a big part of how we go, and really critical now because of how fast things are changing. So we do quarterly pulse checks with employees, for example, where we get, employee sentiment back. And I mentioned our KPIs, understanding, transparency, accessibility. We also measure everything at the channel level. So how many people read this email? How many people clicked on this story? How many people attended this town hall meeting? How many people watched the recording? Like, we have all of that data. And so we synthesize that in, we use Power BI, right, which is a great tool to help us kind of create dashboards and illustrate some of the themes, right? And then we make changes. We review that stuff on a regular basis. We have our communicators review the data on how things are performing. I think historically, maybe communications is focused a lot on activities. Let's do a bunch of stuff. Let's create a bunch of content. Let's get stuff out there through whatever channels we can. And I think now it's impact versus activity mindset. And we're making that shift with our teams, right? It's about impact and what is the data showing us versus how many activities can I do as a communicator. So we've seen that shift. We're still working on it, right? It's a mindset shift for people as communicators, but the impact of what they're doing is most important.
You had me at Power BI. So.
Yeah, I know.
Like
right?
the most underutilized and most underappreciated feature within Office 365. It rocks. Absolutely.
Yeah, and a skill that, you've got to hire people into your communications function that are data and analytics and insights experts, not because getting communicators to try to work in Excel or Power BI, forget about it.
I'm smiling right now because it's funny to think of communicators who have been preaching the power of data and measurement and metrics for our clients for a long time now, shifting that perspective to really thinking about internally companies and organizations as a whole other subset of customers. And
it's
totally
the trend, and 3M is very much at the front end of that, of applying those techniques that have been largely used for external and largely even used for marketing and applying them internally. Why shouldn't we be able to apply those tools to just a different stakeholder group? It's still behavior we're looking for, whether it's a purchase or a improve quality or adopt this new process.
Yeah, and I think, we even surprised our executives, right? When on a quarterly basis, we started bringing them a dashboard on, okay, we go right to our C-suite leaders and say, here's a dashboard of the last quarter, everything we did from a communication standpoint, how it performed, what are the insights, and what are we going to do differently this next quarter for you? And I think it just opens their eyes to, the strategic function that communication is, right?
I love thinking of a dashboard and picturing that whole scenario of even just thinking about the open rates on emails, or the click through and the time spent watching or time spent active. It's so obvious, but also not obvious. And
it's only going to get better too, because you think about right now on social media, we'll use tools to do automated tools to track sentiment, right? Why can't you do that in the Teams channel, or do that in Slack? You'll be able, or Yammer, you'll be able to do those kinds of things. So we'll be able to even go beyond and start adding sentiment in there with internal audiences too. And it might already be being done in some cases, but it's great.
In terms of staffing up a team like this, Sam, I know that you've trained a lot of your existing C-suite, but have the roles that have been doing the training or implementing some of the measurement, have you seen a need for new roles or new skill sets coming into the organization also to help execute this?
Yeah, I'll touch on just a couple. I think I mentioned the data and analytics skill set. You definitely need that capability, right? And that typically, at least most communications people I know, and myself included, that's not maybe their core strength, right? It's maybe more in the creative space. And so we actually use our one of our service centers to help us do the Power BI work for communications. I think the other one we talked about a little bit earlier relative to kind of middle management or leaders in that area, and some of the skill sets that they need to have in terms of navigating change, the complexities of business, really having people that can support multiple different functions, multiple different businesses, can cross over, can pick up, could support HR one day and could support, our technology the next day, and could support a business the next day. Those are the people and skills, I think. And so we try to, even move people around a little bit, right, to get people to broaden their skill set, broaden their mindset around understanding the business better. But those are two of the things that we're really focused on, are really important right now.
Matt, any further thoughts on that? I know
other than to say, it is greatly changed the kind of training we do for executive spokespeople. And I give you a good example of this. Well, actually, in our work with Sam, we've done in the past some training of plant managers, usually for a crisis. Well, then we realized, meaning 3M, realized it's more than just communication in a crisis. It's just communication that needs to happen. And we do a bunch of executive spokesperson training for a big academic medical center, and the medical doctors who are in leadership positions are required to go through training. And it used to be media coaching. And Sam brought this up a little bit earlier. Now the training program there's a module on just communications fundamentals. There's a module on not media coaching, but Q&A delivery, because it could be a town hall, could be this kind of thing, a podcast, could be a media interview. There's another session on effective presentations. There's another one on effective written communication and one on social media. And so the training has been fundamentally changed because we're asking leaders to communicate through different channels and in different ways.
I think that's just such a good kind of summarizing thought there, which is the shift really, really boils down to this fundamental change in communication style. And we're no longer in an era where media training can solve all of the problems. It's a holistic approach to how we're thinking. So I know we've covered a lot, and we could probably have a whole secondary conversation on this and keep going, but parting thoughts or things that we've really should have covered that we didn't. I know I have a lot of other questions, but we are also at
Sam, go first. So. He's a guest here.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Megan, for having me on. I think, as communicators, I think it's just it's changing rapidly, right? And so, doing benchmarking consistently, talking to people, like I said, like Matt, and people in agencies that are working with a lot of different clients. I mean, meeting even with vendors that maybe you already have a solution for that, but trying to understand where they're going with their strategy. I think all of those things are really critical nowadays. Because like I said, it's just changing rapidly, and we've got to be, as great communicators are anticipating, right? We're ahead of where things are going. In order to be ahead, you've got to be having all these connections and gleaning the insights before someone, internally in the company asks you or tells you where to go, right? We should be guiding the company to a certain extent, where they should go, or we should be ahead in terms of communication. So that's our goal, but there's my parting thought. Thank you.
It's a good parting thought. The leaders, the people who are in leadership positions right now are managing an environment that they've actually never seen in their career. And it's been largely driven by external factors. That's changing how they're showing up as leaders, and it's changing how they're communicating. That in turn has an impact on those of us who are professional communicators who advise them. We have to show up differently. We have to understand the environment they're living in. We have to understand, as Sam said, the complexities of the business, and bring forth perspective that helps show that we understand that complexity. And we need to do more than just produce and create content. We need to help advise those leaders on what they should be doing as well to be successful in this environment.
Thank you both. This has been Sam Sventek and Matt Kucharski. I'm Megan Keogan, and this has been the Provoke Media Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks both.